Hi everyone, and welcome to Completing the Square Part 2. If you haven't seen Part 1, then I suggest you probably look at Part 1 first, because this just builds on top of that particular process. Alright, so we're looking at completing the square. Slightly different with this one is because it's a little bit more awkward, because there's going to be a number in front of the x squared. Alright, so please don't jump to this one if you've not looked at the first video. Please look at the one that involves just x squared on its own. Alright, because if you don't understand that bit, you're probably not going to understand this bit. Alright, but for everyone who has looked at that bit and is okay with that, then stay with me. We're going to look at it where you've got a kind of number in front. Alright, so I'm going to give you two worked examples to look at. Alright, so this first one is probably the easier one. The second one a little bit more complicated, so you're going to have to bear with me. But obviously, knowing this process is, again, you're now starting to aim at those high grades towards the top end of GCSE, which is, I guess, why you're looking at it, is probably where you want to be. Alright, so completing the square. Well, let's have a look. First of all, you've got 2x squared plus 8x minus 4. Well, now when I complete the square, when I looked at part 1, all I had was x squared and then something else. So this 2 is the problem. Alright, so there's two ways we can deal with it. It is there, I can't ignore it, but I have to kind of contain it. But if I look at these three very, very carefully, I'll notice that they're all multiples of 2, and that's going to make my life a little bit more straightforward. It's because what I can do is I can factorise it. I can take out the 2, and it's going to make my life a lot more straightforward. Okay, so if I factorise it and I put 2 outside, then I've got 2x squared. I've got 2 lots of 4x, that gives me 8x, and then 2 lots of minus 2. Alright, so divided each of these three terms by 2 and taken it outside of the bracket and left you with this. Alright, now this bit that's in the bracket now looks an awful lot like the ones we had in part 1, where it's a normal completing a square kind of process. Alright, so that's what we're going to do now. Alright, so let's look at the bracket. Ignore the 2 for the time being. Alright, so when I look to complete the square inside the bracket, I'm going to half the value of 4, which gives me 2. Alright, so x plus 2 squared. And again, that came from part 1, so x plus 2 squared. And then I'm thinking about what is 2 squared. Well, 2 squared is 4, but I've got minus 2. So how do I go from 4 to minus 2? Well, I need to take away 6 from that. Okay, alright, so 2 squared is 4, take away 6 gives me minus 2. Alright, so that bit now inside the bracket is exactly what I had in part 1, the values of a and b. Okay, at this point, now you could argue, should I leave it like that? Well, no, because this 2 does have an impact. It does have an impact in terms of what it should look like. So I need to multiply it back, everything that's in the bracket back out by the 2. Well, the first step's relatively straightforward. I just put a 2 in front of the x plus 2 squared. Alright, 2 in front of the x plus 2 squared, because that is a big double bracket, and I don't really want to get into doing all that, because what I'm going to end up with is probably something looking exactly like that, which is not what I want. So I'm going to leave that x plus 2 squared and just shove a 2 in front. Alright, but the 2 and the minus 6, well, yeah, I need to sort those two out. Okay, so 2 times minus 6 is going to give me minus 12. Alright, and again, I mentioned it in the first part, and I'll mention it again now. It's the whole purpose of me getting these two numbers here, this 2 and this minus 12, are about what we do when we're looking at a graph. Alright, because these two values will give you the turning points. Alright, so I don't want to go into it now, but there is a video on turning points, and please look at that video so you understand what these two numbers mean when I talk about turning point. Alright, but that's how we do that one. Okay, let's just look at one more example, because there is another one to focus on, which looks a little bit like this. But I guess you could argue the process is the same, isn't it? Alright, hopefully you can see that the number in there is a value of 3. Again, so there's a 3 in all of it. So again, I'm looking to kind of take that out. Okay, so I've got 3, 9 and 6, so divide them all by 3, and then end up with something that looks very, very similar. Okay, little bit more awkward in this case, because I hopefully can kind of spot that there's a problem with this number in the middle. Alright, and the reason that is, I'll not say a problem, but it just makes it a little bit more awkward in terms of your calculations, is because it's an odd number, and that number there is the one that we will be halving. Alright, and then when we think about what that means, it just makes it a little bit more awkward to kind of deal with. Alright, so this is the kind of question you're going to get to the back end of a paper, and you've just got to be careful. All I would say, be very, very careful with the numbers that you've currently got. Alright, so let's do it. So the 3's on the front, and then we're going to look to half this number. All right, so what's half of 3? half 3 is 1.5. All right, so 1.5. So x plus 1.5 squared. And you can see from here, we've skipped a step a little bit. All right, you've skipped a little step. So what we need to be thinking about is, what is 1.5 squared? Well, 1.5 squared. Oh, there's two ways you can do that. Well, of course, if it's a calculator paper, you can just put it in your calculator and that will give you an answer. If it's not a calculator paper, then this is your skills of thinking about fractions, probably. Well, if I think about 1.5, that is 3 over 2. All right, well, 3 over 2, when I square it, well, if I square the top number, that gives me 9. I square the bottom number, gives me 4. So that gives me 9 over 4, which is 2.25. All right. So what I'm doing in my head is what some of you probably need to do, kind of written down, is you're trying to calculate what is 1.5 squared. All right. And I convert it to a top-heavy fraction, and then I find it a little bit easy to work with. So 3 over 2 times 3 over 2, so times in by 2 fractions, which give me 9 over 4, which, converting back, would give me 2 1/4. All right. So those are the kind of skills which you need to look back at in terms of other videos if you're not quite sure about that. Alternatively, you could just write down 1.5 times 1.5 and try and figure it out like that. All right. However you do it, you know, you've got to be clear on what those kind of processes are. All right. Let's get back to this. All right. So 1.5 squared. Well, 1.5 squared is 2.25. Well, I need to go from 2.25 down to 2. So I need to take away 0.25, which is where this has kind of come from. All right. So there's a little bit of calculation taking place in here, which isn't written down. All right. So you need to think about what that kind of process is and how much you need to kind of spend time on doing that, especially when it's an awkward number like this. All right. So like we did with this one, we're going to multiply it out. So this first bit is relatively straightforward. It pretty much stays as it is. So we've got 3 bracket x plus 1.5 squared. All right, that stays like that. But of course, we do times the 3 by the 0.25, like we did last time, which gives us a minus 0.75. So it looks a little bit more horrible, which of course it is. And that's because we're starting to deal with odd numbers, which means we start to deal with either fractions and decimals. All right. Now I've left my answer here as decimals. You don't need to. You know, you can leave them as fractions. It doesn't really matter. I guess what you're really after is just trying to make sure that 0.75 or 3/4 is right, and therefore you'll get all the marks, whether it's decimals or fractions, either way. Okay, so please do, you know, go to mathsschool.co.uk website and have a good practice on those. It's kind of an area I'll probably say it's worth a practice because it relates to turning points, which I've mentioned a couple of times. All right, so please do look at that video as well, as to understand why we complete the square and what that means in relation to turning points. Okay, thanks for listening.